I never thought I would find myself here, standing in the shadow of doubt, questioning everything I once held so close. My name is David, and for almost 2 decades, I believed I had everything a man could ask for: a successful job, 2 great kids, and a loving wife, Emily. We had built a life together, one step at a time, through the trials and triumphs. And while we were not perfect, I always felt certain that we were committed. But now, here I am, sifting through pieces of a life that may have never been what I thought it was. It started on an ordinary Wednesday evening. I came home a little later than usual from work. The office had been tense with an upcoming project deadline, so all I wanted was to walk in, kiss Emily, and find some quiet. When I opened the door, the house was surprisingly empty. It was the stillness that struck me first. Usually, there would be noise, our kids chatting, a show playing on the TV, or Emily humming as she cooked. But tonight, silence greeted me, and I felt something unsettling settle over me. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "Running late with Carol. Go ahead and eat without me. Love you." A simple message. Harmless. But for reasons I could not explain, a strange feeling gnawed at me. Carol was Emily's best friend, and they often met up for dinner. Yet something did not sit right. A faint flicker of doubt sparked within me. Something that felt ridiculous, unwarranted. I pushed it aside and tried to go about my evening. But the feeling lingered. I busied myself with reheating some leftovers, glancing at my phone from time to time, expecting an update. Hours passed, but there was no follow-up from Emily. By the time the kids were asleep, my doubt had grown into a full-blown suspicion. I told myself to stop being paranoid, to just trust her. But then I found myself pacing around the living room, each second amplifying my unease. Finally, close to midnight, Emily came home. She looked tired, worn out, and greeted me with a quick smile before heading straight to bed. I wanted to ask her how dinner was, to look into her eyes and feel that reassurance I was so desperately seeking, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I let her slip past, convincing myself it was better not to jump to conclusions. The next few days passed in a haze of doubt. I could not shake the feeling that something was off. Emily's phone was always within her reach, her laughter less frequent, her gaze distant. She was present, but in a way that felt like she was miles away. It haunted me. The tipping point came on Saturday morning when Emily's phone buzzed, lighting up as she stepped out of the kitchen to grab a fresh cup of coffee. The message preview flashed, but before I could stop myself, I glanced at the screen. It was a text from a name I didn't recognize. Just can't stop thinking about last night. "Miss you." My heart hammered as I read the message again, hoping I had misunderstood. I barely heard her footsteps as she returned to the kitchen, holding her coffee, a warm smile on her face. When she noticed the look in my eyes, her smile faltered. "David, are you okay?" she asked, setting her coffee down, a slight tremor in her voice. I forced myself to hold her gaze, swallowing down the mix of shock and dread that was forming in my chest. "Emily," I started, keeping my voice steady. "Who's texting you at this hour?" I gestured subtly toward her phone, my words just barely masking the accusation lurking beneath them. Her eyes flicked to the phone for just a second, but it was enough. I saw a flash of something there, fear, maybe, or guilt, that was gone as quickly as it came. She picked up her phone and forced a laugh, shaking her head like it was nothing. "Oh, it's just Carol being silly," she said, brushing it off too quickly. "You know how she is." But I knew Carol well, and I knew that no best friend would send a message like the one I had just seen. Something inside me cracked open, raw and wounded, and I found myself in a place I had never imagined. Doubts that I had been trying to suppress all week now flooded in. I thought of her late nights, the distance in her eyes, the countless times she had said she was with Carol. "Emily," I said slowly, "I saw the message." Her expression froze. The color drained from her face, and she fumbled for words, her usual composure slipping. She opened her mouth to say something, but closed it just as quickly, as if the right words had failed her. Finally, she took a deep breath and met my eyes. "David, it is not what you think." I can explain." "Then explain it to me," I said, barely able to keep the anger out of my voice. I wanted to understand, to hear any reason that would make sense of the message I had just read, any excuse that would make this nightmare dissolve into something forgivable. She hesitated, and in that pause, I felt everything unravel. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she avoided my gaze, in how her hands twisted together as she tried to find her footing. "There's someone I have been talking to," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But it is nothing, really. Just a few messages here and there. I got carried away, David. It was a distraction, nothing more." The words came out in a rush, and I felt the sting of betrayal strike hard. "A distraction?" I echoed, disbelief and anger twisting together in my chest. "We have been married for 16 years, Emily. 16 years. And you call this a distraction?" Tears glistened in her eyes, but she did not look away. "I know I have hurt you, David, and I am so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Then why?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why did it happen? What was so wrong with us that you needed this?" She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, I could see the weight of years of unspoken feelings hanging between us. "I don't know," she whispered. "Things just started feeling hollow, and I felt alone. We were just coasting, David, like we were roommates sharing a life instead of a couple building one." Hearing her say those words gutted me. I wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong, that we were solid, that I had always loved her. But as the silence stretched on, I realized she was right. In my pursuit of work, of providing for our family, I had drifted away from her without even realizing it. I thought I was being a good husband by being a good provider, but I had missed what she needed most. But that did not excuse her actions. That did not erase the betrayal I felt searing through me. "So you thought it was better to find comfort with someone else?" I asked, unable to mask the bitterness in my voice. "Instead of talking to me, you turned to a stranger?" She flinched, and I could see the guilt clouding her face. "I know I was wrong," she said softly. "I should have come to you, I should have been honest. But somewhere along the way, I got scared. Scared that maybe we had lost what we used to have, that maybe you would not want to work on us." Her words cut through me. We had been together for so long, shared so much, and yet here we were, two strangers on opposite sides of a chasm I had never seen coming. "Is it over?" I asked, needing to know if there was still more to her story. If this was just the beginning of a long list of secrets she had kept from me. She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Yes. It never went anywhere physical, David, I swear. It was just words, but I ended it. I wanted to believe her. I wanted so badly to think that this was just a mistake, a horrible lapse in judgment that we could somehow move past. But trust, once broken, does not simply heal overnight." The silence between us stretched, heavy with all the words left unspoken. Finally, I took a deep breath, the weight of it filling my lungs like lead. "We need time, Emily," I said, my voice hollow. "Time to figure out where we stand, what this means for us." She nodded, her face crumpling as she tried to hold back fresh tears. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I could not bring myself to do it. Not yet. The betrayal was too raw, too fresh. That night, I slept on the couch, my mind racing with everything that had happened. The days that followed felt surreal, like living in a fog. Emily and I danced around each other in the house, exchanging only polite words, sometimes none at all. She tried to bridge the distance with small gestures. A cup of coffee, a gentle touch on my shoulder as she walked by. But I found myself pulling away, unable to shake the feeling of betrayal. Friends and family noticed, though they kept their questions to themselves. Our 16 years together had been marked by stability, by an outward appearance of strength. But now, in quiet moments when I was alone, I would sit and think about how much had changed with just a single message on her phone. One night, a week after the truth came out, I found myself back at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from me where Emily usually sat. The house was still, and a familiar weight settled in the air as I let my mind wander back through our years together. I thought of the night we met, how she had laughed easily, the way her eyes sparkled whenever she was telling a story. I thought of our first tiny apartment, Our excitement over the life we were building from scratch, the long nights we spent planning our future. Where had that version of us gone? I realized that, somewhere along the line, I had taken it all for granted, assuming that we would always be there side by side. I thought that as long as I was providing, as long as we kept moving forward, things would remain solid. But life had worn us down in ways I had not anticipated, chipping away at our bond, replacing warmth with routine, love with obligation. A sudden thought hit me. Maybe Emily was not the only one who had pulled away. I had been distant too, so consumed with my own duties that I had overlooked the small signs of her growing loneliness. I had missed the sadness that had settled behind her eyes, brushed off her occasional attempts to reconnect. I could see that now, but it was painfully clear that hindsight was not enough to make things right. Just then, I heard Emily's footsteps approaching. She stopped at the doorway, looking at me with a tentative expression, as if she were afraid of disrupting my thoughts. David, I know it might be too soon, but her voice trembled, raw and hesitant. Would you be willing to talk? Really talk about what happened, about us? Her words were soft, and for a moment, I felt a surge of anger rising again, the reminder of how deeply she had hurt me. But I realized this was also a moment to decide if I wanted to hold on to the pain or if I could try to let her in, even a little. I nodded, motioning for her to sit down. She took the seat across from me, hands folded on the table, waiting. Why, Emily? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you feel like you needed someone else? She took a deep breath, and for a second I thought she might break down, but she held it together. I was lost, David, she said, searching for the right words. I felt invisible, like I was fading into the background of your life. You were always busy, always preoccupied, and I started to feel like I wasn't needed. I tried to tell myself it was enough, but it was not. Her words stung, but they also opened up a side of the story I had not seen before. I thought back to all the nights I had stayed late at work, the times I had brushed off her attempts to connect, thinking that tomorrow would be enough to make up for it. Why didn't you say something sooner? I asked, my voice softer this time. Why didn't you tell me how unhappy you were? I tried, she said, her voice barely a whisper. In small ways I tried, but eventually I was too scared. I didn't know if you'd listen, or if it would just make things worse. A heavy silence fell over us, each of us sitting with our own guilt, our own part in how things had fallen apart. It was not just her mistake. It was ours. We had both let things drift, let years pass without really seeing each other. After what felt like an eternity, I spoke again. Do you still have feelings for him? She shook her head quickly. No, it was never real. Just an escape. Something that made me feel seen for a moment. But it wasn't worth what I've lost with you. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt something crack open in me. Maybe it was the acknowledgement of shared blame. Maybe it was hearing her say she regretted it. Or maybe it was the raw honesty between us. But I felt a small spark of something. Hope, perhaps, flickering in the distance. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said honestly, my voice strained. But I want to try. I want to see if there's anything left between us worth fighting for. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, reaching across the table to grasp my hand. I let her, feeling the weight of that small gesture, the fragility of the connection we were trying to rebuild. We can take it one day at a time, she whispered. If you'll let me, I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm still here, that I want this. It was not a promise of happily ever after. It was not an easy answer or a sudden fix. But it was a beginning, a tentative step toward healing, toward trying to rebuild what had been broken. It was the start of a long, painful journey we would have to face together. In the weeks that followed, Emily and I worked on finding our way back to each other. There were moments of anger, frustration, and doubt, but there were also small moments of kindness, of honesty, of rediscovering the reasons we had fallen in love in the first place. It would take time, more time than either of us had anticipated, but for the first time in a long while, I felt that maybe, just maybe, we could make it through. And although the scars of what happened would remain, I had a glimmer of faith that, with patience and honesty, those wounds could slowly heal. Months went by in this careful balancing act. Emily and I established a routine, going to counseling together once a week, even when it felt unbearable. We agreed to be honest, even if the truths were painful, even if they dredged up memories that felt better left unspoken. There were times when I thought I could feel us moving forward, inching towards something better, something real. Then, there were days when everything felt hollow, the echoes of what had happened resurfacing in the quiet of our home. It was an endless tug-of-war between resentment and forgiveness, between holding on and letting go. But little by little, I began to see her again, as if she were emerging from some shadow I'd never noticed before. And in those rare moments, I began to believe that maybe our life together could survive this, even if we would always carry the weight of it. One evening, we had finished dinner, and she was clearing the table as I sat, sipping the last of my coffee. There was an ease in the silence, a familiar comfort that had been missing for so long. I watched her move through the room, noticing the small things, the way she hummed as she worked, the softness in her eyes when she glanced my way. She looked up and caught me watching, and for a second, we both froze. "David, thank you," she said quietly, putting down the dish in her hand, "for giving us a chance. I know it hasn't been easy for you, and I know you didn't have to." I nodded, letting her words settle over me, feeling the sincerity behind them. "It hasn't been easy, no, but I keep thinking about what we had, Emily, what we built, and there's still a part of me that thinks it's worth saving." For a moment, there was nothing but the two of us, standing on the edge of a life we were trying to rebuild. The tension softened, replaced by something unspoken and steady. It was the beginning of trust, a fragile thing that we both understood could take years to fully restore. Over time, I came to realize that the affair had been a symptom, not the cause of what was wrong. It had forced us to confront all the things we had buried under years of routine and quiet avoidance. We had built a life together, but had failed to nurture the relationship at its heart, letting it grow stale and distant, even as we clung to the comfort of habit. In that realization, I found some semblance of peace. Not forgiveness yet, but an understanding that softened my resentment, that reminded me I was also flawed and had my own share of regrets. The months that followed were not without setbacks. There were arguments, moments of doubt, and days when I would see a flicker of the past in her eyes and feel the sting of betrayal all over again. But each time we faced these hurdles, we learned something new about each other and ourselves, finding small ways to bridge the gap, to reconnect. One Saturday, we went for a drive to the old spot by the lake where we'd had our first date. It was a chilly day, the sky overcast and gray, but the air was fresh, and the quiet surroundings felt calming. As we walked along the shore, Emily slipped her hand into mine. It was such a simple gesture, yet it meant more than words could capture. I felt something shift in me, a quiet acceptance that I had been holding back. We sat on a bench, overlooking the water, wrapped in silence, letting the peace of the lake wash over us. "David," she began, her voice low, "I can't change what happened. I'll never be able to take back the hurt I caused. But I want you to know that I am here with you. All of me is here now with you, and I'll do everything I can to make sure that's enough." Her words, honest and raw, reached a place in me that I had kept walled off. I looked out over the water, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past begin to ease, if only slightly. "I know, Emily," I said finally. "I believe you, and I think I'm finally ready to start trusting that." In that moment, sitting beside her, watching the ripples on the lake, I felt the faintest glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't a promise that everything would be perfect or that the hurt would magically disappear, but it was enough to make me believe that we could still find happiness, even with the scars that had marked our journey. The years passed, and little by little, Emily and I rebuilt our lives, weaving together new memories that softened the harshness of what had once threatened to destroy us. The pain of betrayal never fully vanished, but it became a part of our story, a reminder of what we had faced and overcome. And as I watched her laugh with friends, hold our newborn grandson, or dance around the living room to her favorite song, I felt an overwhelming gratitude that we had chosen each other, again and again, despite everything. Our love was different now, tempered by time and hardship, but in many ways, it was stronger, more resilient. It was a love that had weathered storms, that had been tested in ways we could never have imagined. And though I would never forget the pain of what happened, I had come to realize that sometimes the hardest journeys bring us the greatest strength. In the end, Emily and I had found our way back to each other, not as the people we once were, but as two flawed, resilient souls who had learned the true meaning of forgiveness, of loyalty, of love that endures even the darkest of days. And that was enough. That day by the lake marked a turning point, but life carried on with its ups and downs, and we had to make the choice to keep moving forward every single day. In some ways, it was like starting from scratch, relearning each other's quirks, hopes, and fears, but with an added layer of honesty that hadn't been there before. Our journey wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that meant more to us now than the illusion of perfection ever could. I had spent so many months holding on to the past, to the image of what I thought my life should look like, to the anger that had been a constant companion. But as the years passed, I noticed the edges of that anger softening, making room for something deeper, more genuine. I'd find myself catching glimpses of Emily when she wasn't looking, and instead of seeing the woman who'd hurt me, I began to see the woman who had been by my side through every storm, who had stayed even when leaving might have been easier. Emily, too, was different. There was a depth in her I hadn't fully seen before, a quiet resolve to put in the work, to stay steady even when the road ahead looked uncertain. She took up new hobbies, began volunteering in the community, and rekindled old friendships she had let fade. It was as though she was finding herself again, and watching her grow in this way made me feel a strange sense of pride and joy. We were no longer defined by the roles we had played in each other's lives. Instead, we were carving out new spaces for ourselves while still choosing to share this journey together. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, she turned to me with a look that was both serious and hopeful. "David," she said softly, "I want to thank you for giving me the chance to prove myself to you again. I don't think I would be who I am today without you standing beside me." Even when it was hard, I nodded, setting down the dish towel and reaching for her hand. "I'm grateful for you too, Emily. It's been a long road, but I wouldn't trade where we are now for anything." I meant it every word. I could see that we had both changed, had grown into versions of ourselves that we might never have become if it hadn't been for the trial we'd faced together. As we grew older, we found ourselves surrounded by new generations. Our children, grandchildren, and extended family who filled our home with warmth and laughter. They knew our story, or at least the parts that mattered, and they saw us not as a couple who had everything figured out, but as people who had weathered life's storms with resilience and forgiveness. One night, as we watched our grandchildren play in the yard, Emily leaned her head on my shoulder, and I felt that familiar sense of peace wash over me. We sat together in comfortable silence, the years of hurt and healing woven together in a way that only time could create. Looking back, I realized that the life we'd built, though it had been shaken, had ultimately stood firm. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't need to be. Our love had been tested, rebuilt, and transformed into something stronger than I had ever thought possible. And so, as I sat there with Emily by my side, our hands intertwined, I knew one thing for certain. We had chosen to stay, to forgive, to keep trying even when it felt impossible. And in the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. Our story wasn't about the affair or the anger or the broken trust. It was about the choice we made day after day to love each other in spite of everything. And as I looked out over our family, our life, I felt a deep, abiding contentment, a quiet joy that came from knowing that we had not given up on each other or ourselves. In that moment, with the echoes of laughter filling the air, I knew that our love, flawed and weathered as it was, had been worth every single step of the journey.